Welcome, everybody. In November 2020, Etihad Credit Insurance, ECI, and UK Export Finance, two very strong institutions who are well engaged in terms of export credit agency, one an insurer, one a guarantor, announced a cooperation agreement. And I'm very pleased and honoured to have both ECI, UK Export Finance, in the form of Massimo Falcioni, the CEO of ECI, Richard Simon Lewis from UK Export Finance, and Jan Ward, the CEO of Corothum International, from an exporter's perspective, to be talking about this cooperation agreement. And my first question is really going to be to Massimo. So in my experience, cooperation agreements fall into two camps. They are either very much talked about, they're signed, huge amounts of publicity, but nothing gets done, or they have real substance and huge volumes that flow through in such a manner that they become the norm and people forget that behind it, there's a partnership and a cooperation agreement. So Massimo, could you talk us through this announcement and where you see the main opportunities going forward?
Gabriel, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to share this panel of such esteemed people and professionals, and also I'm sure there will be a lot of industry leaders and a lot of people interested in what you are trying to comment today. Yes, you're right. Sometimes such kind of agreements, MOUs, start with a strong marketing and might be perceived as just an opportunity to communicate a little bit more on the institutions, but then they don't pick up. Well, I don't think that this is the case of the agreement which ECI has done with the UKEF. Firstly, I would like to say that if we look at the figures we start of trade between the two countries, we immediately understand that we are entering in a field where it would be quite challenging to do more than what is existing, but our commitment is actually to double or triple what is currently in between the two countries. And if you allow me, let me comment exactly what I'm referring to. If we look at the non-oil foreign trade between the UAE and the UK, for instance, in the first 8 months of 2020, it was in the range of an excess of $5.5 billion. And again, the UAE's non-oil export to UK accounted approximately to $500,000, which reflected, by the way, a growth rate of 25%. Now, the data we have from the UAE Minister of Economy shows that the non-oil foreign trade between UAE and UK previous year in 2019 was approximately, we have 36 billion dirham, so approximately $10 billion, where 27% were non-oil export and re-export. So I think it's quite active between these two countries. Now, the UAE and the UK, I mean, the UAE is the 5th largest Britain's export market outside Europe. And the total trade among the two is estimated approximately around 18 billion pounds. This happened last year. And the figure is also expected to rise even more. Now, this agreement entered inside this kind of framework. So there is a lot of trade already between the two countries. And our idea is to facilitate even more the opportunity between the two, easing access to the information from the two export credit agencies, so both can underwrite better credit limits and push on open credit terms exchange rather than on cash payment or the old-fashioned and expensive and sometimes lengthy letter of credit from the banks. So we want to accelerate what is already there. So the first guarantee that this will work is that we are entering already on a big highway, and our idea is to make it much faster than how it is today. The second important point is that we have a support of very important gentlemen behind us, and I mentioned specifically His Excellency Dr. Thani bin Ahmed Al Saudi, which is the Minister of State for Foreign Trade of UAE, which clearly highlighted of the importance of this agreement, and also putting this in terms of the economic agenda, bilateral agenda between the two countries. So this doesn't have only an economic reasoning, but also political reasons in order to strengthen the already very solid relationship between UAE and UK. And on this, I mirror also what was the statement from the UK Minister of Export, Mr. Graham Stewart, who said absolutely the partnership will boost UK trading relationship and business in both countries. And the reasoning is, he mentioned also because UAE is diversifying its export away from oil and gas into other sectors like renewable energy, which is, we know, it's exactly very important for Mr. Stewart. Just recently, he mentioned about the strategy of UK, especially on this hybrid and this renewable energy. And so this is very, very important. So we combine country interest, we combine something that it doesn't go by scratch, is already there, and the strong will from Louis Taylor, the CEO of UKF, and myself to make this to be something very supportive for the two countries.
Massimo, thank you for that. So I fully understand that, you know, part of this cooperation agreement is to strengthen trade between the UK and UAE. But Richard, if I may turn to you, I'm really interested that the other part of the cooperation agreement is to help UK and UAE businesses secure export contracts anywhere in the world. And I would be keen if you could drill a little deeper on your thoughts on how this export partnership will bring this about, and importantly, whether any new products or solutions will be brought to the table as part of this partnership. Richard.
Okay, thanks, Gabby. So, I mean, the sort of metaphor that that Massimo used, I think, was, you know, a highway, and essentially, you know, the agreement, the partnership agreement, was sort of designed to, you know, add momentum, add velocity, speed to, you know, trading between the two countries. And I think just extending, you know, that metaphor, additional lanes on the highway moving both ways is also part and parcel of what we're trying to do. So I think that given, you know, both institutions have a sort of global outlook, we recognize that the Middle East is, you know, our busiest market, the most significant market for us in terms of volumes of business that we execute. But clearly there are other markets which, you know, both institutions will have an interest in. And, you know, we are looking to build out both the sector breadth and the regional breadth to our activities into other markets such as Africa, Asia, where Emirati companies and UK companies are going to be actively looking for business. In terms of additional products, I mean, clearly, you know, the core product suite that both institutions have are incredibly strong. You know, we have a similar portfolio of products. We are constantly exploring and evolving the products that we have, particularly in a pandemic where you recognize that supply chains need greater support. You'll have seen, you know, some of the liquidity offerings that we've put in place in the UK, predominantly directed at the UK supply chain through the Export Development Guarantee. And we clearly have a clean growth direct lending facility, which we're hoping is going to bring through greater renewable energy and clean growth opportunities as defined under the green bond principles. So I think in terms of, you know, is there a particular tailored product that we believe we need to sort of bring into play under this agreement? I don't think that's the case, because frankly we're dealing with a very strong counterparty ally in ECI, with a very strong product suite, a very strong balance sheet. But clearly I think both ECAs are forward looking, and therefore we need to be on our mettle in making sure that whatever products we have work both in our domestic markets and around the world.
Yeah, I'm gonna come back to you on that. I mean, UK have got a very flexible UK content rule. 20% UK content, you're able to support up to 85% of the contract value. Does the partnership change this in any way? Does, for example, exports from the UAE count towards the 20% UK content?
What a great question. I would have to take that to one of my underwriting colleagues. I don't know whether Massimo has any particular visibility on that, but rather than say that notionally that might be the case, I'd have to take that one away, Gabby. I would say not, but clearly if Massimo has a different view or perspective, then let's hear it.
I agree with Richard, what you just mentioned, but I would say a very interesting thing. When we talk about these agreements, Gabriel, we look only at trade, but sometimes there might be also another important element which we are very active in, which is projects. So this is very important. There are a lot of UK companies which they do projects everywhere in the world. And the components of a project don't come only from one country, might come from multiple countries. This is where we will really create a big add value to the whole, and there would be a lot of supply from there. Richard, I think that
well, and we have there's a project in common. I think that we are we're both institutions are involved in currently, and I think the reason why I slightly hesitate from mentioning it, I don't think it's yet in the public domain, but it is with a very large global player who can multi-source. It's in a third party country. Both institutions are heavily involved in structuring the transaction, putting the transaction to bed. And I think when we're in a position to disclose the transaction, we will issue a joint statement. So in answer to your question, Gabby, look, this is broader than, trade links and trade volumes between two close friends. This is something that frankly will span other markets.
Okay, and I think this is a great opportunity to bring Jan in. Jan, it'd be good to get a bit of an overview about your business and your interest in this cooperation agreement. The announcement talks about how the UK and UAE are diversifying exports away from oil and gas into renewable energy. I'd be interested to see how that's going to impact your business, particularly today, I'll rephrase that, particularly how in last week or so, the UK government had closed its submission requests for aligning UK international support for clean energy transition, where the UK government said, and they made it very clear, that it will no longer provide any new direct financial or promotional support for fossil fuel energy sectors overseas, other than in exceptional circumstances. And I'd be interested in your thoughts, Jan, whether this announcement is a way for you to still be active in this sector, but looking at it from a UAE perspective.
Yes. Okay. My business is, this particular business is a manufacturer of very specialist materials that go into very critical parts of process plants. There are lots of other applications, but that's our main sector that we deal with, and it has been historically oil and gas. However, with the new technologies that are coming along for renewables, there is still a need for these very specialist materials. And in fact, as these processes start to develop, you find that there are more and more special materials required. And graphene is a very good example. Composites are also another example. And so what we've been doing over the last probably 5 years now is watching and contributing to, in fact, the R&D with some of these renewables. The issue is commercialization of them. So when these new technologies are being developed, they look great in the lab, and they are very useful and they look like they will perform. But it's only when you try to do it on an industrial scale that you start to really understand how effective they're going to be and whether they're affordable. So part of what we do is to try and make these processes, some of them are quite difficult processes with a lot of chemicals involved sometimes, lots of heat, high pressure, develop better materials that will cope better, but will also reduce the pollution that they might generate. So when you say clean energy, sometimes the process behind it isn't particularly clean. And so this sort of funding is absolutely vital, because those projects and those things that are going to go towards developing those new technologies are expensive. And the growth capital that you need to be able to fund those as a SME, for example, or even a large corporate sometimes, you'd need that extra help with working capital to be able to develop these processes. And so in fact, you know, although it appears from the outside that this is a bit of a blow to companies like ours, I think it depends on how flexible and how quickly you can adapt. And this funding will actually be extremely important in that process.
That's interesting in that, you know, to UKEF's credit, they do provide, you know, a lot of flexibility in terms of liquidity funding, their development guarantee and their general export finance facility. You know, there have been huge facilities that have been undertaken, which is on offer to UK companies with the support of their banks. But what is it, Jan, that is in this partnership agreement that you think adds something else over and above what UK Export Finance already does?
I think more than anything else, it's the connection. It's the roadway that Richard was describing. You know, from a small business's perspective and a medium-sized manufacturer's perspective, the information and communication of awareness is the #1 reason why this will be successful. UKEF have done, I think, a number of specific events in London and in the country that they're dealing with. This particular one that I was involved with was for Saudi. And they bring together the supply chain into the event. And they do lots of advertising, make sure that people are aware. And I think that's one of the most important things, that you're bringing together the UAE companies and the UK companies through this agreement. Companies like mine find it quite hard to know exactly what is going on in the project's area, bearing in mind that we're sometimes 2, 3, or 4 removed from the tier 1 that's doing the job. And so from our point of view, being able to have both sides, you know, we have offices in the Middle East and obviously the offices here, working together with these 2 agencies will help enormously in getting more companies from both sides to work together.
And okay, that's Jan, that's really interesting. And Massimo and Richard, it seems clearly you have a fan with Jan there at this moment in time. And as Massimo, you were saying, you know, and in the announcement, you know, there's already a very impressive figure of 17.8 billion sterling going between the 2 countries in terms of trade. I mean, what is the aspiration under this agreement to move that figure to what and by when?
Well, the ambition is to double and possibly triple this in the next 5-10 years. And this could be the 2 steps we can put as objective. And as Jan mentioned before, I couldn't say it better, to be honest, the reasoning of the importance of this connection. She talked about partnerships. So the 2 government entities with private, and together we create an ecosystem which can ease the corporates, any size. But she mentioned specifically, Jan, and I like the SMEs, which are the ones which mostly need more support in terms of information, education. And this is also where ourselves and with the UKEF, we work together to ensure about proper set of information, education. And also, I will mention capacity, because Jan mentioned one important equation. New technology implementation success is linked to proper funding. So the new technology as a cost doesn't come for nothing. Then it will be repaid because it's sustainable. But it has an important original initial cost, which we have an important responsibility for the entrepreneurs, but also for our society. And we are very committed with the 17 SDG Sustainable Development Goals. And some of them are clear that we need to contribute to a sustainable economy, and putting new technology goes into that direction. So this commits us even more in order to support. That's why the numbers should be much more than that. There will be need to replace some existing technology, and there is need of additional one. Digitalization is one. In healthcare, we saw how much investment we need to do. Renewable energy, same. So I think that from my team and myself, and Richard and Luis' team as well from UKF, we have a huge titanic work to do in the next 5-10 years. And the numbers will be, I mean, generous to us.
Okay. ECI provide credit insurance. UK Export Finance provides a guarantee. How, from a banker's perspective, should they be treating support under this agreement from a credit and regulatory capital perspective? Richard, how would you answer that?
Yeah, I mean, clearly in relation to the sort of capital treatment that the banks apply to, guarantees and to ECI insurance. I mean, Gabby, the interpretation by banks is different depending on which bank you're talking to. So, we are, not going to be, prescriptive. I think the central banks and how they treat ECA support is something that's very sort of case by case, and depending on which market you're in and where your bank is domiciled. But I think fundamentally, the key strength of both institutions is our credit ratings. So I think irrespective of whether a bank is looking at the ECI insurance or whether the bank is looking at the UKF guarantee, they will be looking through those two things through the lens of having very strongly rated institutions. So I think that's got to be incredibly favorable. And I think if you look at some of the banks that have come alongside this agreement and have basically very sort of physically shown their support for what we're doing in this agreement, you've got, I believe, HSBC and Standard Chartered have signed up to the partnership arrangements with ECI. So that gives you a sense of the strength of the bond between UKF and ECI, and frankly, the foundation that we have in terms of our credit ratings.
So does that mean from a bank perspective, they have the flexibility, or that you're providing the flexibility of, for example, if a bank wants ECI to be fronting the transaction, that UKF will be providing reinsurance behind the scenes, or vice versa?
Well, there's a reinsurance agreement behind this. So I think, frankly, as you know, both institutions are very good at structuring transactions and working closely with commercial banks. So frankly, we will work in a way that maximizes the execution capability that we have in front of us. And frankly, the two banks that I mentioned are clearly world-class ECA banks. So, it speaks for itself.
Okay. If we have time, and hopefully we do have time, and I'm looking for a flag from Jeff on this, but one of the things I found really interesting about the UAE is that UAE is the fourth largest investor in Africa, and you've got 26 double taxation agreements between the UAE and African countries. I'd be interested to see whether you see this as and there's a lot of South-South trade going on between UAE and Africa. And this is a question to all three of you, and we do have 5 minutes left. So I'll be interested in your viewpoint as to whether this cooperation agreement could be a way, in your eyes, to do more business in Africa, And the reason I say that is that, the IMF just announced that there's about 9 countries in Africa where their GDP growth is going to be in excess of 6%. And so there's a lot of interest in terms of what's happening in Africa. And I just wonder whether your timing of this is really going to give more of a push into that continent.
Well, all I can maybe say in relation to that is clearly we are looking at transactions with ECI in Africa. So I don't know whether that answers your question in a sort of necessarily detailed way, but keeping client confidentiality, we are looking at deals in Africa. So Massimo is nodding, which is always a good sign. So yeah, that's the answer to your question. And I think the other point I wanted to make, Gabby, was we are looking to, as I mentioned previously, to get real breadth, global breadth to our activities. And I think off the back of support that we've had from Treasury, we're tripling the size of our overseas network. So we have David Moleshead, with a very close relationship with Massimo on the ground. We've got our trade commissioners, we've got our heads of mission, but we are tripling the size of our UKF country head network around the world over the next couple of months. So we're increasing it to 30 country heads around the world. And clearly having this relationship that we have with Massimo in ECI, and then having that network will allow us to go into these markets with UK supply chain, with the Emirati supply chain, and do some really interesting things. So I just wanted to make that point, because you rightly focus on Africa, but frankly, there are other markets where, we're putting a lot of investment, Latin America, Asia, North America in relation to renewables. So I just want to make that point.
Massimo, anything to add before I go to Jan?
No, Richard said very well. I would like just to mention one important thing. The proximity between Africa and the UAE, it of course calls for Africa to be a very important market for the UAE. And thanks to the agreement we have done with the UKF, we would like to really work together and offer opportunities to UK companies to exploit that. One recent important initiative has been done specifically by the government of Dubai, and this is called the WLP. This is something which is interesting. It's the World Logistic Passport. What is this? Actually, it's a platform supported by the government of Dubai through all its logistic operators. So it can be maritime, can be cargo, fly cargo, can be also the customs, in order to facilitate any exchange of trade from the UAE and the African countries, removing the traditional barriers, which might be in the range of custom duties or import duties or access to funding or maybe guarantees. And this is something that we will put with our partner UKF in order to do that together, and to accelerate and enhance even more all the UK companies who want to benefit about the WLP. So it will be an incredible corridor. I think will be the future of trade, because it will remove all the barriers, will accelerate trade, will facilitate, will be great. And this will be towards Africa. And many African countries have adhered to this because of what Richard even mentioned before, the strong connection between the UAE and Africa. So I think this will be very interesting to see in the future. But as Richard mentioned, we need also to look at Asia. Asia is going very fast. COVID-19 showed us that what we're supposed to be, like for instance, China to be the first economy in 10 years' time, maybe this will be much closer. And we don't have to lose the opportunity to see these Asian countries which are growing very, very fast. So we have to look at two different directions.
Okay. Jan, it's right and fitting for a corporate to have the last word.
Thank you. I mean, I've always seen the UAE particularly as a place for exporting to the rest of the world. It's a very central place. It's always been a trading post. And, you know, the free zones give enormous opportunity to companies to be placed there and to export beyond. And Africa, you know, the MENA region, obviously, but also into Africa, India as well. I mean, anybody that's been along the creek 20, 30 years ago, it's just, you know, constant coming and going of vessels from India. And so I think the idea that you are able to use some of these facilities for your UAE company to then export globally it makes perfect sense, and is just a continuation really of where the UAE is always sat in terms of trade. So for me, I think it's making sure that the supply chain, tier ones all the way down, are aware and take use of it. I think that's the big thing. Because especially in the UAE's smaller companies and even some of the bigger companies, when they're going for the very large projects, they will really need help with the finance for those. And as long as it's then trickles down to the supply chain, which will eventually obviously come back to the UK and the UAE, for me, it's, you know, the sort of projects that we do on a day-to-day basis are generally outside the UAE anyway. So a third country export is not really anything unusual at all.
Perfect. Well, a great way to end. And thank you all for providing the insight. And hopefully we could have a discussion in a year's time to see how much growth has been done. And you know, rather than just see this as one announcement, but nothing gets done.
I will score you when we come back.
Don't score me, score these
time.
two.
These two, yes, I will score them.
I can tell you now that you know, I'm reporting into Louis Taylor, our chief executive. We never sign agreements like this, and frankly, we sign very few agreements like this lightly. So this is absolutely at the centre of our radar. We're going to make it a success. I think in Massimo, you know, we have a very close partner. So I think you can put us on the spot, Jan, in 12 months' time and see where we are.
Well, give Louis my regards and tell him I will be.
God. You can hold our feet to the fire.
Yes.
Thank you very much.